Jason and I negate contention one is discrimination of minority groups, subpoint A, feminism. Attempts to reduce debt will inherently require austerity measures. Kimberly Amadeo writes in 2018, austerity measures are reductions in government spending and increases in tax revenue taken to lower deficits. These steps have historically disenfranchised women. Philip Inman 17 writes, austerity by governments meant that the increasingly limited availability of good jobs were going to men. Excluding women from good jobs deepens overall inequality with negative consequences for growth. Giving women access to decent employment could only be achieved if governments maintained investment. Steep cuts in early years education and healthcare effectively ask women to pick up the slack. Francis Ryan quantifies in 2017, by 2020, women will shoulder 85% of the burden of the government's changes to the tax and benefit system. The UN in 2016 concludes, gender equality is a fundamental human right. Advancing gender equality is critical to all areas of a healthy society, from reducing poverty to promoting health, education, protection, and well-being. Affirming traps us in a cycle of oppression. Subpoint B is the poor. Historically speaking, austerity measures hit the poor the hardest. A 2013 Oxfam study concludes, when austerity measures are taken, the poorest tenth of the population are by far the hardest hit, seeing a 38% decrease in their net income. Affirming worsens gender and income inequality. Contention 2 is infrastructure. Affirming means cutting many crucial areas of infrastructure. This is likely because we've already seen it put on the chopping block to reduce spending. Matthews 18 says Trump's budget has a 22.2% cut to the Army Corps of Engineers. Cutting these programs would be devastating because they provide key benefits. This comes through water infrastructure. Aher 17 explains the Army Corps of Engineers is enabling more than $70 billion worth of cargo to be shipped annually. This program has even reduced debt. As Cohen 18 says, investing $1 in water infrastructure returns a full $2.03 in tax revenue to federal governments. Prioritizing growth increases in infrastructure investment. This is likely because Reuters 18 writes the administration is expected to ask Congress for $200 billion in federal spending on infrastructure. The impact is jobs. Austin 14 writes African Americans receive jobs from infrastructure investments. The infrastructure investments can help reduce the unemployment gaps for blacks and Hispanics. Josh Bivens 2017 writes each $100 billion in infrastructure spending would boost GDP by $150 billion. This increase in GDP would in turn boost employment by over 1 million workers. Contention 3 is the wrong time for debt reduction. Monetary policy exists outside the jurisdiction of policymakers and fiscal considerations. After a decade of the lowest interest rates in history, the Fed has begun to raise rates. According to Amanda Dixon on Monday, the Fed is widely expected to raise its benchmark interest rate next Wednesday. This will be the fourth rate hike of 2018 and ninth one since the central bank started working to bring interest rates back from nearly zero 3 years ago. Rates are still far below historical averages. As they increase, the money supply contracts, causing economic losses. John Mauldin quantifies in 2017, writing, the loss from a 1% increase in U.S. interest rates would exceed $2 trillion globally. These increases have caused massive volatility in the U.S. economy. The Washington Post wrote on Monday, U.S. indexes have been lurching up and down since October, mostly down. Volatility has been high not only week to week, but minute to minute. These losses in corresponding volatility have the economy on the verge of recession in 2019. Stan Cho wrote last Friday, with economic growth expected to slow and interest rates expected to rise, many are forecasting 2019 will be a rocky year for stocks. For the past decade, the Fed kept rates extremely low to promote economic growth following the 2008 financial crisis. That helped lift all kinds of markets, but now the Fed is gradually raising interest rates, and expectations for more have been one catalyst for recent selling. The Fed is normalizing interest rates, putting that tool back in the toolbox for future recessions. However, we must leverage the deficit to do so. Evan Horowitz analyzed the situation in September 2018, writing, the deficit is actually helping to prop up interest rates. A concerted effort to right-size the federal budget could create a situation where the underlying Goldilocks interest rate ends up far below zero. Central banks might find themselves unable to get even close to the low level needed to allow the economy to thrive. Belt-tightening could plunge the economy into a bottomless recession. The impact is jobs. Newman 18 writes, in a recession, unemployment could rise rapidly to around 7.5%, pushing the number of unemployed from 6.1 million to 12 million, and thus we negate.
We negate in our sole contention. That is the wrong case. It's been a long day. Sorry about that. We affirm. Right now, the U.S. is in a lot of debt. Amadeo of the Balance reports this year that the U.S. debt exceeded $21 trillion on March 15th of 2018. This problem is being compounded by irresponsible deficit spending. Franco of VoxEU writes this September that expansionary fiscal policy is blowing up the deficit on both the tax side and spending side. Most notable is a tax bill passed by the Republicans in December of 2017 featuring big tax cuts in the corporate income tax. This is an especially bad time to push up the budget deficit, as the retirement of the baby boomer generation means that big deficits are coming in Social Security and Medicare. Thus, Raj Gopal of USA Today quantifies the government ran a $152 billion deficit in August. The budget deficit was $107 billion in August 2017, 41% less from the newest data. High levels of debt are highly problematic for two reasons, and the first is recession severity. Karens of Time writes this October that 2/3 of business economists in the U.S. expect a recession to begin by the end of 2020. A plurality of respondents say trade policy is the greatest risk to that expansion. We are able to escape from the last recession due to a relatively strong debt-to-GDP ratio. Gil Arducci of Forbes writes that in 2008, the government had collected revenue from the booming economy. The debt-to-GDP ratio was a low 64%. When the Great Recession hit, the government had room to borrow to finance our fiscal lifesavers, including the ARRA, which helped keep the deep recession from turning into a global depression. However, this is no longer the case, as Gail of Brookings warns this year that when the inevitable recession comes, we will be in deep trouble. The reasoning comes from Tully of Fortune in March, who explains that countries with high debt don't respond aggressively to downturns. If the U.S. slips into the recession, we'll lack the option of lowering taxes or increasing spending on infrastructure, for example, as tools to revive growth. As the debt load grows, efforts by the Federal Reserve to stimulate the economy with lower rates would be more likely to feed runaway inflation. Then investors will dump treasuries, driving rates far higher and making the budget picture even worse. Countries who are able to sufficiently combat recessions are usually able to return to normal GDP levels within 3 years. Unfortunately, the situation seems dire right now. As Aaron of Brookings writes, in countries without capacity, GDP remains about 10% below pre-recession levels after 3.5 years. In the U.S. context, the cumulative loss of GDP over 5 years following the onset of a moderately severe recession would be in the range of $6 to $7 trillion, about 1/3 of 1 year's GDP. The second is foreign investment. As the U.S. debt pile gets increasingly larger, Goodkind of Newsweek writes in May that foreign investors who currently hold about 43% of government debt are getting skittish about purchasing it. Foreign investment in the U.S. debt is currently at its lowest point since November of 2016 and has been decreasing steadily since 2008, when foreigners owned about 55% of U.S. debt. When fewer foreigners buy our debt, the economy is put at risk. Goodkind furthers that if foreigners buy less debt, Americans must buy more, and they're buying at the expense of making productive investments in businesses and startups. A problem called crowding out. As a result, the dollars diverge to the Treasury from other investments, our economy experiences less GDP growth, and wage growth slows. There are two impacts, and the first is unemployment. Longer recessions and less business investment means slower growth. This is problematic, as Sanchez of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis reports in 2012, a 1% decrease in GDP has been associated with a slightly less than 2 percentage point increase in the unemployment rate. Second is wages. Collins of USA Today writes this year that average income in 30 years will be $5,000 less per year if the national debt continues at its current trajectory. This means less money to spend on daily necessities like food, gas, and clothing, or to put extra money in your savings account or 401ks. Thus, we affirm.
We're going to start back.
So what you're telling me is that the way to soften the blow of the recession is to lower the debt, right? So that means that you have to balance the budget in order to decrease the debt, right?
You have to pursue policies that decrease our debt. We're gonna.
No,
I mean, I'm sure you. Okay, I'm sure you're gonna try to tell me that we need to implement austerity.
I guess my question is how do you plan to balance?
So if you look at any bipartisan plan to reduce the deficit, whether it be Simpson-Bowles or Domenici-Rivlin, none of them talk about increasing taxes while decreasing spending. They always because you do one or the other. For example, what Simpson-Bowles does is it simplifies the tax code and raises and decreases it into
Sure, like, do these pieces of legislation, are they enough to like actually balance the budget and like run a surplus rather than a deficit? Because if you're not running a surplus, how do you decrease
these different plans, like we can show you a graph of the different ones, all would drastically reduce the debt. Some of them, at worst, maybe to like 60% of GDP, other ones to like 20%,
so like
we're even lower than 2008.
But like we're running, real quick though.
Yeah.
Like we're running an $800 billion deficit right now, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, do these plans account to like change this $800 billion deficit?
Yes.
Like fully?
Yes.
You have a question?
Yeah. So, on your third contention, so your claim is that high deficit spending leads to higher interest rates.
No, what we're telling you is that interest rates are like going to be increasing in both worlds.
Increasing both worlds. So what's your link?
No, so it's like, so after 2008, when we saw like the recession, right? What happened is the Fed like implemented quantitative easing, so what that causes, the interest rates went down to zero. 3 years ago, they started raising them again. They have to like keep raising them now so they can like be prepared in the event of the recession to occur. Actually, on Wednesday, they're going to increase them by 2.25%.
What's your link?
What do you mean, what's my link?
Like a link is what happens when you.
No, I get. So like, what would you rather have? Like the interest rates be at zero? Like, what are you talking about? So why do you think interest rates are rising?
They're rising because of the business cycle, just because they inevitably go up and down. When the economy is doing well, interest rates go up. Like if it was true that there was a connection between deficit spending and interest rates, there would not be over the past 50 years there have been huge increases in the deficit, but the interest rates have also gradually decreased.
I don't really know what you're trying to get at, really.
I'm just saying like there's no. I'm just like very confused.
All we're telling you is that interest rates are going to be continuing to rise. So I have a question.
Well, how do you generate offense?
Yeah, okay, so basically what we're saying is that when the interest rates continue to rise, so that's basically like contractionary monetary policy, right? Okay, so what we're saying is that if you prioritize the debt reduction as well, that's contractionary fiscal policy. Horowitz tells you that if you try to contract the economy on two fronts, that's what causes a recession and causes it to be really severe. I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you talk about like foreign investment stuff, where have we seen a precedent of foreign investors pulling out at the point where we have like a AAA rating in credit and stuff?
Yeah, so A, our credit rating was downgraded from AAA to AA, but B, our evidence indicates that in the 2008 recession, we used to have there used to be 55% foreign ownership of our debt, now it's 42%. That's a lot lower.
We're going to take some prep starting right now. That was 15 seconds. Okay, the order is going to go down their case. Is everybody ready? Okay. They first try to start out with this narrative that debt is really bad, but acknowledge that the United States can continue going into debt because the United States has huge assets that allow us to do so. Dr. Foster in 2017 tells us that our debt of $20 trillion isn't too bad when you look at the total worth of the United States at $128.18 trillion. That's ultimately why Capella in 2018 tells you that for advanced economies like the United States, our debt capacity appears to be infinite. They never proved that why we can't just keep going into debt into perpetuity. Instead, this is why Nobel Prize-winning economist Krugman in 2018 ultimately tells you that the debt spiral, which they're trying to link into, can only happen if interest rates on the debt exceeds the economy's growth. That means that you need to prefer economic growth because it's allowing us to grow out of this. More specifically for two reasons. The Wall Street Journal in 2017 provides both when they tell you that a 3% growth rate would stop the debt to GDP ratio from skyrocketing out of control. That's their internal link, is the ratio, not just the quantifiable number. But second, they continue to say that if we were to grow at 3% every year by 2047, that would mean we'd be taking in $2.5 trillion more in tax revenues every single year. That internally solves back for the debt problem. But first, let's jump into the recessions argument. They first argue severity. Keep in mind one key thing here. They need to prove the bright line for how severity actually works. If a recession is coming up within like the next 12 months, they need to show you how they reduce our debt enough in order to solve for this recession in the first place, and they also need to prove how severity really works and how its impact is like magnified. But second, we tell you that if they do try to prefer solving this deficit crisis by 2019, that means harsh austerity cuts because they're going to have to make massive cuts within the budget and increase taxes a massive amount. That's really bad because, first of all, when the United States has done this in the past, it's been detrimental. Hirsch in 2013 tells you if the federal government were not to have pursued its austerity policies in 2011, we'd be growing at 3.3% a year rather than the current 1.9% a year since 2010. An America without the politics of austerity would have added an estimated 8.2 million jobs. But austerity would also be bad because it links into our case too. The Oxfam evidence from 2013, who we read you, tells you that when austerity measures are in place, the bottom 10% of people lose 38% of their income. That's really bad. But this also impacts into the long term because the balance in 2018 tells you that measures such as harsh austerity and contractionary fiscal policy slow economic growth and actually make it more difficult to raise revenue needed to pay off debt. Ultimately, Elliott in 2017 concludes that the IMF said that austerity policy on net do more harm than good. Second, let's go into their point about foreign investment. A couple of big problems here. Their internal warrant is like crowding out as a result of Federal Reserve increasing interest rates. This doesn't make sense for two reasons. The first of which is because the Federal Reserve is literally an independent institution. They behave on their own. They're outside of the scope of like the federal government. But second of which, the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates no matter what. Because the TE in 2016 tells us from 1971 until 2018, the United States interest rates have tried to average 5.7%. When we're currently around 2%, obviously they're going to keep increasing their interest rates because they want us to be prepared for the next recession that happens in the first place. But even if you don't buy that analysis, ultimately this foreign investment isn't inherently good because the European Trade Study Group in 2012 shows an analysis that FDI can actually crowd out domestic investment within a region and may hurt a country's ability to naturally grow on its own. Let's go to their impacts. Their first impact is unemployment. They try to tell you that decreased GDP increases unemployment. The entire thesis of the negative case is that you need to increase GDP because that inherently decreases unemployment. Which world do you think solves for unemployment better? The world that increases economic growth and solves for this, or the world that simply enacts harsh austerity measures that actually are detrimental to the people in the long term? But their second impact is wages. They're literally only linking into $5,000. They don't terminalize this in any way, shape, or form, and second of all, they don't prove why $5,000 makes the world of difference. Our impacts are going to outweigh because we show you that in the long term, if you care about like reducing the budget and the deficit as well as preventing like a recession, you need to look to our case.
Let's start, Brent.
Oh wait, sorry. This is the 8.2 million jobs thing.
Yeah.
Sorry. Thank you. All right, judges ready? Opponents? Starting on my case, Los Santos. Start on my case. Group like the foster evidence, the Capella evidence, or improvement evidence. This evidence is just generally about why debt is not bad. It doesn't answer our specific warranting about why debt is specifically bad because it decreases investment and crowds out. These are not responses to our case. Let's go a little further where they say that increasing growth decreases debt from the Wall Street Journal. There's two responses. First, this does not reflect reality. While growth in theory may decrease the debt, the growth that has been pursued for the past 40 years has been mostly tax cuts, like the Trump tax cut of last year, that reduces the tax base. When you cut taxes, the government makes less money, so even though the economy grows, the Washington Post explains that the debt has increased substantially. But two, as Capella of Brookings explains, you actually see reductions in the debt through economic growth, we have to see unprecedented levels of growth. Things like 50% rises in productivity that the US economy has never seen, and that those levels of growth will probably overheat the economy in the first place. So growth does not solve debt, but the other way around, debt does increase growth. Now let's go a little further on this idea of austerity cuts during a recession. There's two problems here. First, the 2011 austerity cuts have nothing to do with what we're talking about. Those cuts were put in because after the Tea Party won in 2010, they wanted to show that they're in business. But as Noah points out in the Crossfire, according to the Center for Responsible Budget Policy, every single likely politically passing debt proposal policy does not advocate for austerity, but it's moderate cuts in spending, and most likely it's just increases in taxes. So this does not link in. But two, this is also a short-term impact which you have to realize, because even though in 2011 there may have been some of these harms, the economy bounced back at so much that we have reached full employment already, showing that austerity is not a long-term impact. Now let's go a little further. On our second point, they say that interest rates are independent. This is not a response. All this does, it takes out their third convention, which I'll get to later. But like, our argument is not about higher interest rates. It's just that the foreign investors are worried because the U.S. debt is unsustainable and they're dumping U.S. bonds. As Noah points out in Crossfire, we've gone from 50% in foreign investment to 43%. That is a decrease. But then they say that FDI is bad. This is not FDI. This is not building buildings or like investing in the U.S. economy. It's just buying U.S. Treasury bonds. There's no relation here. Let's go to their case. On their first contention, I have four responses. Okay, so you can group their subpoints A and B because they both rely on the austerity. So the first problem with this is that you can cross my consent on committee on responsible budget, which is that no proposal proposes serious austerity measures. But like for example, they're just going to raise the retirement age. But two, the New York Times explains that as the debt increases, the U.S. has to pay more interest servicing debt, so much more that actually by 2030, all of our non-mandatory spending will go towards servicing the debt. But this goes towards servicing the debt. This takes out their argument because it means that effectively we are going to see austerity-like policies in a world in which we don't reduce the debt. Now, we outweigh on long term because this trend will never decrease so long as the debt increases. But austerity is a short-term policy at best. But three, my third final response is that crowd-out also affects this because when crowd-out happens, businesses have less investment and they lay off workers. And the first workers to go, according to my opponents, are minorities and poor Americans who are disproportionately targeted. Let's go to their second contention on infrastructure. There's three problems here. The first comes from the New York Times, which you can cross-fly, which is that when you see there's infrastructure investments get crowded out when you have to pay more on the debt. Again, this is a long-term trend. But two, Lowell explains that actually Trump's plan that he proposes, it says $200 billion of federal funding, but it's $1.5 trillion overall, which means most of it has to come from state and local government, which is bad because Lowell explains that increases privatization, public-private partnerships, and that does two bad things. A, it increases costs because private companies charge more than the government, and B, it makes the actual infrastructure worse because private companies do not build high-quality infrastructure. But three, the FEE explains that even when the government does fund infrastructure, they usually spend it on wasteful, big-name projects. For example, these subways in New York are really terrible, but even though it takes me an hour to get to school, Mayor Cuomo, even if it takes an hour to get to school, they just built a new subway lane in the Upper East Side to benefit wealthy people. But we're saying that infrastructure investment disproportionately helps the wealthy people and does not go to the poor people who actually need it. Finally, on their third contention, as Noah points out, they just don't have a link here. Monetary policy and interest rates have nothing to do with the debt. And evidence of this is the fact that Stein finds that even though the debt has gone up for the past 40 years, interest rates have gone down, showing that there's no link, and if we reduce the debt, it would not impact interest rates and would not impact the rate of recessions, as my opponent wants us to believe. Thank you, and we encourage an affirmative ballot.
During curiosity, when I see the responsible budget pricing, there's nothing that's supposed to
Yeah.
It's okay, by the way.
Yeah.
Is everyone ready? Okay. So what is your link for debt being bad?
Our link is simply that when the U.S. has more debt, foreign creditors think that the U.S. becomes less reliable, so they dump U.S. bonds, forcing U.S. consumers to buy those bonds, which crowds out U.S. businesses.
Okay, so
this is all summarized in our dependence.
Yeah, but so like, why is this coming now and not have happened in the past if our debt is already so high? Like, why hasn't it happened yet?
No, it is happening.
Like, our bonds are being completely dumped.
50% to 43%.
So do we not have a AAA credit rating for bonds right now?
No, we have a AA credit rating. It was downgraded. That's what Noah said in the first cross.
So you're saying that right now we've already seen the spiral like starting right now?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's what Goodkind says very explicitly.
You can have a question.
So you say that increasing growth solves back for the problems of debt. So
Yes.
how does voting con increase growth?
So voting con increases growth through, like, for example, our contention to about infrastructure investment.
Okay.
Every $100 billion you invest in
Okay,
infrastructure.
sorry,
Yeah.
just okay.
Okay.
Is that the only way, or what other ways?
I mean, there's a lot of ways. I'm not quite sure exactly what the policy will be, but that's like.
Well, but that's the way that you specified. That's the one that's pressure to the round, right?
Okay.
Okay, so let's talk about infrastructure.
Yeah.
Right? So why does infrastructure spending improve the economy?
Infrastructure spending improves the economy because it creates jobs, creates transportation routes in which like commerce can travel throughout. It basically builds an infrastructure for an economy to function on.
So how do politicians decide where they spend on infrastructure?
I mean, I don't know exactly where all infrastructure projects are going to happen. That's why this is an advocacy position, and we're not talking about like a specific like bridge that should be built.
Yeah, we're not either. All we're saying is that infrastructure tends towards areas that are already wealthy, people who pay high taxes to their constituents.
So is
Like
that
the example I
federal?
gave
Is
for
that
people in
federal level infrastructure investments, or is that state level?
It's all infrastructure investments because the reason is that like wealthy people have bigger say in the government and can decide. Like, for example, people in the Upper East Side have control over city council. And they can say, New York, don't fix the subway rail system, build me a new pretty station.
Okay,
Very great.
so because
I
it
think
benefits that group, it means that like this infrastructure is inherently bad.
It doesn't
Is
mean
that
that
like
it's
what
bad,
you're
but that it
arguing?
doesn't address the actual problems.
Okay.
Like they can build a Chinese station and say everything is good, but people still can't go to work and people still can't get jobs because infrastructure is bad.
Okay,
So
could I have
it's
a
not
question?
about economic growth, is what I'm
Yeah.
saying.
So do you agree that interest rates are increasing in the status quo?
They're going up.
Okay. You can have a question.
All right, let's talk about interest rates.
Yeah.
So interest rates go up and down primarily because the Federal Reserve wants the business cycle to run fairly smoothly, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what does increasing or decreasing the debt have to do with that?
Yeah, so we tell you that right now because the Fed is enacting contractionary monetary policy by increasing interest rates. That's slowing down economic growth. People are incentivized to invest in like these public bonds. But that is an exact reason as to why the United States cannot do the same. If the United States is contracting at the same time the Federal Reserve is, that just leads to a recession.
So it's like growth.
Oh, sorry, false start. Could we see the Capella evidence saying that you need to grow by 50%?
Bell says 50% increase funding.
Continue, right.
no basis of their case, our case, I'll signpost.
I can hear you. Sorry.
It'll be their case, our case, and I'll signpost.
Ready? Is everyone ready? Start at the top of their case, a few key things to remember. First, on the Wall Street Journal, I've been saying that 3% growth. They try to tell you from Capella that we need 50% growth. All that means is that they can see that we need economic growth in order to actually have this happen. That's solvency for us. This is a clean place to be voting for us. But secondly, go down to the horse evidence, which tells you that in 2011 we implemented austerity measures. All they try to tell you is that the budget for policy card says that, like, all the legislation says there isn't austerity measures. Call for the evidence. It literally says that all the plans proposed decrease spending and increase taxes. That is literally austerity. That means this is really bad for two reasons. First, Oxfam tells you that when you implement austerity measures, the bottom 10th are hurt the most, decreasing their income by 38%. But secondly, the balance tells you that when you implement contraction or fiscal policy, this slows down the economy. And Elliott tells you that this is really bad because austerity creates overall more harm than good. This is an easy place to be voting for us. But overall on this contention, they don't prove to you a bright line as to how much you have to decrease the debt in order to actually see their impacts manifest. Insofar as that they don't like show you any mechanism as to the fact that debt's actually going to go down, you're not going to see the recession actually soften. However, we say that we would actually solve for the recession in the first place, but we'll get to that in a little bit. Jump down to the second point about foreign investment real quick. Remember, Jason tells you that, like, on interest rates really quick, the fact is the Fed is independent, but we'll get to that when we get to Architecture 3. Jump to our first connection about discrimination. A few key responses. First, again, they only tell you that the proposed legislation doesn't implement austerity. Again, call for the card, it literally does. That's really important because we tell you that from Ryan, women have to pick up 85% of the slack. That's really bad for them. That increases inequality. But secondly, again, from Oxfam, we tell you this harms the marginalized communities even more. Jump to our second contention about infrastructure, a few key problems. All they try to tell you is that these projects are bad and increasing inequality. However, while the project themselves may be benefiting the people who are already wealthy, actually doing the project themselves is what's helping the marginalized communities. Because we tell you from Austin that African Americans and Hispanics actually decrease their unemployment gap once infrastructure things actually happen. And secondly, Bivens tells you this creates 1 million jobs. Go to our contention 3, which is going to be the biggest place to vote. All they try to tell you that interest rates have been decreasing. Look at since 2008 when interest rates are at 0. 3 years ago, we tell you that interest rates started raising. The Fed is literally going to increase them again on Wednesday. That's really important because we tell you while they're contracting the economy, that means the U.S. federal government can't do the same thing because that's what's going to lead to a recession. They don't challenge this. That's why you're going to be voting for the neg.
I'm going to start out on our case.
Super loud.
Okay, yes. All right. Remember, at the top of our case, our evidence from the balance indicates that the debt is just far too high right now. It's $21 trillion. And as a result, foreign investors are being fearful that we're not going to be able to pay back our debt. And for this reason, our good kind evidence indicates that there used to be 55% foreign investment, now there's 42%. The reason why that is so bad is because American investors are being forced to pick up slack, which means that they cannot invest in productive areas. This is so important because at the bottom of our case, our evidence indicates that when there's less spending on businesses, there's less growth, and each 1% decrease in GDP leads to a 2% decrease in employment. They give two responses. The first one at the top is that growth solves, but they drop Daniel's analysis, which is just the way that we're promoting growth right now is by cutting taxes. And insofar as taxes are too low, that means you cannot make enough revenue to beat back for this growth. And the proof is in the pudding, because in the past 40 years we have had increased growth, but deficit. We've had increased deficit spending, but the debt has also only gone up. Then at the bottom, they kind of drop all. Then that's kind of the only thing they extend. The only other thing that they talk about is austerity. With that, let's go into their case. Call for our evidence. Not a single one of them says that we are going to increase taxes and cut spending. The reason why that is so important is because that means that they really don't get to any of their offense, especially on their third contention, because their third contention is contingent upon there being contractionary fiscal policy. We agree that the economy still should grow, and insofar as that doesn't happen, they don't get to access any of that. But then remember, on the turn that Daniel reads, which does not get responded to, that when interest payments have to go up, the reason why that is so bad is because that extends for infinity. And the reason that is problematic is because that trades off with payments on things like A, social spending, which they talk about in their first contention, but B, on infrastructure, because if I'm paying so much to service my debt, I can't invest in other areas. Then finally, at the bottom, we better link in, even if you believe that there's austerity, for two reasons. One, because if we are stimulating the economy, that means that there's more investment more investment back into businesses, which helps people get jobs. But then second, remember that even if austerity is true, it is incredibly short term. Their evidence about 2011 proves this because we stop austerity. However, in the long term, if interest payments go up, that means they will trade off forever, and that is why we urge you to affirm.
Is everyone ready? Okay. So how much of a trade-off is there with every $1 increase in debt? Is it like a 1-to-1, or how does this work?
I mean, look, we obviously can't provide an exact number, but we do know is that in a few years, interest payments are going to be the highest portion of what we're paying our debt towards.
Yeah, all of discretionary.
But even if it's a high proportion, why does that mean trade-offs occur?
Because the federal government
so much.
So they have to, like the New York Times evidence indicates that as a result of higher interest payments, things like infrastructure are going to be cut, things like Medicare are going to be cut. Because these are big, juicy programs, and federal lawmakers think we have to make these cuts because we can't stop the rising debt. That's what we're going to go after. Can I ask you a question? Okay. So one thing that y'all say in your summary is that we need more growth, and that more growth justifies decreasing debt, right?
Yeah.
But the growth policies that we pursue in that case need to reduce debt, right?
Need to what?
So growth that's happening needs to be enough based on the tax rate to be able to decrease debt. Right?
Well, how do we what are you doing to decrease debt enough to meet this arbitrary bright line?
Yeah, again, this is the question that your partner asked me in first cross. Our evidence that we showed you gives a table of all the different debt proposals, and they all
No, wait. So you're talking about the evidence that you showed me, right?
Yeah.
That evidence literally says at the top, that these plans include both a combination of decreasing spending and increasing tax revenue. How is that not austerity?
I mean, it just doesn't.
That's literally the definition of austerity. That's
Actually, that's not even the definition of austerity. Austerity.
Our evidence at the top of the page
Hold
tells you that's what
on. Hold on. Sorry.
I'll read a sentence from one of them.
Well, you can choose any
No,
sentence
if
you
you
read.
should, if you
It's the
look at
article as
at
a
the
whole.
very top, it says that it includes a combination of.
Okay, sure. So let's not resolve the evidence debate crossfire. Let's
Sure,
try to get substantive, right? So even if we buy, which we are going to dispute, right? But even if we buy that austerity happens, right? You yourself said that in 2011 we had austerity measures, right?
Yes.
But circa 2018, we were at full employment and we were at record high levels of GDP.
Because those austerity measures weren't as harsh as they would be if you forced the United States to try to solve for our entire debt problem before the 2019 recession.
Wait. But okay. We probably should see something. In 5 years, the harms evaporate.
Yeah, no, we tell you that we're growing at a slower rate now than we are. Even if we're growing.
So think about the way.
We've had the second
No, hang on,
longest,
really
We've
quick.
had the second longest period of
Really quick,
expansion.
the way that you guys are trying to solve your case is saying that we are going to reduce the debt in order to soften the blow of like the recession in 2020. The way that
No,
the only way that you
argument is
guys
not
Argument has nothing to do with recessions. That's not.
what are you impacted to?
We are impacted to
Okay. Do you have a question?
Yeah, because people invest, more American investors will be forced to invest in treasury bonds instead of investing into businesses. Because foreign investors used to buy bonds.
Alright, so that's not.
How much time do we have?
You have a minute and 3 seconds.
In 3? Okay, sorry right now.
Actually, sorry, before we start, can we see that evidence in the budget for the budget policy? Evidence?
Okay, starting right now. We're continuing.
Yeah. You can breathe.
Okay, that's time. Okay. The order is going to go growth starting on our C2 and then their C1, and then it's going to go recessions with austerity and our C3.
Clear signposts.
Yeah, I will. Okay. Is everybody ready? Okay. Negating is the only way to the round because you need to look at how you increase growth. That's what they go for at the end of the day. We clean extend the infrastructure argument, which tells you that when you invest in infrastructure, we can create 1 million jobs. Specifically, this impacts also to the disenfranchised because the Austin evidence we read you tells you infrastructure investment decreases the workforce gaps between African Americans and Hispanics and the white population. That's really good at the end of the day. At the end of the day, they're also going for growth good when they're talking about how investors are fearful right now. But remember that they don't have any uniqueness here at the point where we tell you over and over again that the Federal Reserve is increasing interest rates no matter what. This means that crowding out is going to happen at the end of the day no matter what, and they never actually terminalize an impact as to why this decreased investment is really bad for the long term. Obviously, infrastructure is going to grow our economy more. But on this same note, the Wall Street Journal evidence, which we also clean extend, addresses this too. They tell you the status quo isn't solving this right now. That's exactly why you need to prioritize economic growth. They can see that growth can help resolve the debt problem because it reduces our debt to GDP ratio. That's the Wall Street Journal analysis that internally solves. But next to the second voter of the round, which is recessions, they really drop our contention 3 in today's round. It's really clear that we walk you through this link story. As the Federal Reserve is enacting contractionary monetary policy, they're slowing our economy down. The Horowitz analysis, which Ayush extends, tells you that that is a reason why the United States cannot act in tandem with them by slowing the economy down as well, because that, in his words, is what leads to a recession to happen. A recession is really bad because it impacts all of these areas of growth in the long term, and second, because a recession also links into like their case. Second, let's go to the austerity problem. If they're trying to solve for this problem before 2019, that means harsh austerity cuts. Ayush told you that the evidence that they read you means austerity. It's literally decrease in spending and increase in taxes. Call for the evidence that yourself. Austerity is really bad for a couple of reasons. The balance tells you it slows economic growth in the long term. Oxfam tells you that the bottom 10% lose 38% of their incomes and 85% of the burden is placed on women. If it hurts growth in the long term, don't implement austerity. That has been their advocacy at the first of this round.
Just checking. I have about 15 seconds.
You have 7 seconds, actually.
Alright, I'll stick to it. Alright, is everyone ready? Starting on my finance case. first and second contentions about interest payments crowding out government spending. My opponents come up here and make this big deal about austerity policies, but they ignore what happens in a world in which we don't prioritize the debt. In a world in which we don't prioritize the debt consumes ever more of the U.S. federal budget, and our New York Times evidence indicates that means we will see cuts to things like Medicare and infrastructure. So, effectively, you will see austerity policies implemented in a world in which we don't have the national debt. This is a turn on their link, and by affirming it means we solve that. So, at worst, this is terminal defense, because it means that, at worst, there will be some austerity cuts in either world, but that won't really change. But we're going to win the austerity issue anyway, because as Noah points out, our evidence indicates that at most we would need to see moderate increases in taxes and moderate cuts in spending, not austerity. That's the first place you can affirm. Quickly on their third contention about monetary policy, as we have explained, interest rates just fundamentally do not reflect debt levels, they reflect what the Federal Reserve is doing in the business cycle. So their link really here is growth, so whichever team is winning economic growth and helping the economy wins this contention. The second place that you can affirm is on our contention about crowding out. Remember that the debt is going up right now. It's at $21 trillion, and this is spooking foreign investors because the debt is looking more and more rickety. That is why our evidence indicates that foreign investment has dropped from 50 to 42%, a massive cut. And when foreign investors buy less U.S. bonds, U.S. citizens have to make up the slack and buy more U.S. federal bonds, and that is really bad because it means that there is less investment in businesses. And as Noah points out, this drops GDP, and every 1% drop in GDP drops the drop rate by 2%. This is a clean way to vote and is not responded to by my opponents. My opponents' only response is that interest rates make this not unique, but that misses out warrant. Interest rates always go up and down, so foreign investors don't really care about that. They care about if they're going to get their monies back, and they think that the debt means that they won't get their money back, so that's a problem. Finally, they say we should prioritize growth, but as I point out, all growth prioritization policies in the status quo in the last 40 years have increased the debt because they've increased taxes. But even if my opponents win their austerity argument, we still win the round for two reasons. One, because Noah points out we stimulate the economy. But two, remember, austerities are fundamentally short-term issues. The 2011 austerity that they point out did not affect the economy because right now we are still at full employment. But our impacts are long-term, because if the debt continues in the long-term, it has no end in sight. But austerity does have an end in sight when we do balance the budget, so it's a short versus long-term issue, and we solve for that. Thank you.